I have been many things in my life. Proud, people said, and they were not wrong. Cold, they whispered at the backs of ballrooms, and I let them. The Duke of Aldmere does not soften for the crowd. That was the lesson my mother drilled into me before I could shave, and I wore it like armor for more years than I care to count. But I was never what Elspeth Crane believed me to be. I was never the man who took her heart, folded it in silk, and threw it out with the morning rubbish. The truth of what I did, of what was done to both of us, took 11 years to surface. 11 years of silence, of cold rooms, of watching the wrong life close around me like a fist. When the truth finally came up into the light, it was not I who surfaced it. It was a letter, dozens of them in fact. Found in a locked cedar box under my mother's bed, 3 weeks after she died, by the only member of the household staff who had served long enough to know what he was looking at. I will come to that. I must begin where the story begins. I must begin with the autumn the vicar came to Aldmere Parish and brought his daughter with him. I was 26 when Reverend Thomas Crane arrived at the village of Aldmere with his 3 children and a battered trap that shed one wheel before it reached the churchyard gate. I watched from the upper window of the hall. I was in the habit of watching the lane in those early weeks of autumn, when the road from the south was still passable, and I had a faint, unexamined hope that something might arrive to break the particular gray sameness of my days. What arrived was a man of perhaps 50 in a worn coat, apologizing to his horse. Behind him climbed a boy of 14 or 15, scowling at the mud. And behind the boy, quiet and unhurried, stepped a young woman who looked at the fallen wheel with an expression that was not dismay but something closer to mild amusement, as if the world were simply confirming an opinion she had already formed about it, and the opinion was charitable. She wore a plain gray pelisse, serviceable and not new. Her hair was the color of dark honey, braided and looped without artifice. She was not the sort of woman who stops a room. My mother would have said so immediately, with the precise calm she brought to all pronouncements of social fact, and my mother would have been technically correct. Miss Elspeth Crane would never stop a room in the way that mattered to ballrooms and to title hunters and to the particular machinery of a London season. She would, as I would discover, stop a man in his tracks at entirely unexpected moments. In the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a season, in the middle of his entire carefully constructed life. But she would do it without meaning to, without technique, and that was the thing that made it impossible to defend against. I watched her repin her brother's coat with the particular economy of someone accustomed to managing small disasters, the coat being, by the look of it, 3 sizes too large and held together at the collar by a button that had been resewn recently and not with great confidence. She said something to the boy. He was still scowling, and whatever she said made the scowl shift just slightly toward reluctant acceptance, which struck me, even from a window, as a minor feat. Then the vicar laughed at something his horse had done, and she turned and looked at him with an expression that contained, all at once, affection and patience, and a sort of resigned tenderness, the expression of someone who has long ago made peace with loving an impractical man. I turned away from the window because a duke does not stand at windows staring at vicars' daughters. I went back to my desk and my correspondence and my afternoon. But I remembered the wheel. My mother appeared in the doorway of my study 3 days later to inform me that she had called upon the new vicar's family and found them perfectly civil and perfectly unsuitable for intimacy. This was her highest category for people who lived in the village. The category below was useful but not to be encouraged, and below that lay a descending scale of social infractions that I had learned to navigate by the time I was 12. Perfectly civil and perfectly unsuitable meant that she had drunk their tea, assessed their furniture, determined that they had nothing to offer Aldmere Hall socially, and filed them appropriately in the mental architecture she kept for the management of county relations. I did not argue. I very rarely argued with my mother in those years. I had learned early that argument with the Dowager Duchess of Aldmere was a landscape without exits. She did not shout. She did not weep. She did not, in any visible way, fight. She simply erected walls of absolute calm, and one found oneself alone in a smaller and smaller room until one agreed. The Dowager Duchess, Dorothea Lady Aldmere, born Dorothea Stanhope of the Wiltshire Stanhopes, was a woman of formidable presence and what she called correct feeling. She had managed this estate through my father's long illness, a wasting thing that had taken 8 years to complete itself, and then through the 7 years between his death and my majority with an iron precision that I genuinely admired. The precision was real. The books were impeccable. The tenants were managed. The roof was managed. The roof's particular opinions about autumn rain were managed. And when I came into the dukedom at 19, I found an estate in better order than many of my peers had inherited from fathers in full health. She had opinions about everything. She had opinions about the weather's moral implications, and about which families in England had earned the right to the color burgundy, and about the correct way to remove gloves at a dinner table, and about what it meant to be a Stanhope in a family that was now a different name. And she had opinions, deeply architecturally organized opinions, about the proper conduct of a Duke of Aldmere. Among those opinions, the Duke should have correct feeling about his position. The Duke should marry correctly. The Duke should not speak at length to Vicar's daughters, or call at the vicarage without cause, or be seen walking with a young woman of no position, no fortune, and no family that bore repeating. I obeyed all of these instructions for approximately 2 months. What broke my obedience was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and it was not romantic in the least. I was riding back from the East Fields. There was a drainage dispute with a tenant farmer, an elderly man named Wicket who had been farming the same 3 acres since before my father could ride, and who had a view of easements that predated written records and was all the firmer for it. The dispute had been grinding on for 6 weeks, and on this particular Tuesday it had reached the stage where both parties were quoting different memories of a conversation that had taken place in 1803, and neither party was inclined to accept the other's version. I had ridden out personally to inspect the south boundary, and had concluded only that the boundary was genuinely ambiguous, and that Wicket and the neighboring tenant, a younger man named Harrow, were both being absolutely inflexible and would require a document rather than a conversation. The sky came down without any particular warning, the way it does in that part of the country, one moment sharp blue and the next pewter gray and actively hostile. I turned for the village rather than the long road back to the hall, intending to wait out the worst of it at the posting inn, which was kept by a man named Collier who always had a fire going, and who would supply hot brandy without requiring conversation in return. She was sheltering in the lich gate of the church with a basket of what appeared to be parish accounts on her arm, and a look of profound philosophical resignation directed at the sky. Not at me, at the sky, as if the sky were a correspondent who had sent one letter too many. "It will pass in 1/4 of an hour," she said without turning, apparently addressing the weather rather than me. I dismounted and tied my horse at the post by the gate and stepped in under the lich gate arch, because the lich gate was stone and the lane was not, and there is no dignity in standing in a lane in November rain when there is a perfectly adequate arch available. "You sound very certain," I said. "My father's church has a weather vane shaped like an extremely emphatic cockerel," she said, still looking at the sky. "It points east when the storm is passing and south when it means to stay. It has been pointing east since 2:30. She glanced at me then for the first time, and there was nothing startled in the glance, nothing of the quick calculation that I was accustomed to seeing in the eyes of people who were determining, upon encountering me, what advantage might be managed. She was merely checking who she was talking to. "Your Grace," she added, and turned back to the sky. I had been a duke for 5 years, and that form of address still registered in me as something slightly external, a costume rather than a skin. I said something entirely banal, something about the drainage fields, or the state of the lane, or how long the rain had been at it. It was the kind of thing one says in a lich gate in November, the verbal equivalent of stamping mud off one's boots. She replied briefly and warmly, and then she said something about the lich gate itself, that it had been built in 1782 by a previous vicar who had, according to the parish records, specified the arch height in a letter to the diocese, and been refused the precise measurements he wanted, and had built it anyway at the dimensions he preferred, and there was still a letter in the county archives from the bishop's office expressing some degree of firm opinion. "You have read the county archives?" I said. "I am indexing the parish burial records," she said, as if this were the obvious path by which one arrived at the county archives, which I suppose it was. "The coverage becomes rather patchy in the 17th century, and I have found that the diocesan and county records can sometimes supply what the parish records lack. Also, I find I enjoy them." She said this last part without self-consciousness, the way she said everything, as honest report. She was 23, I later learned. She was the eldest of the vicar's 3 children, and since their mother's death 4 years previous she had managed the vicarage, the accounts, the parish visiting schedule, the condition of the church's fabric where the vicar had authority over it, and her father's corresponding tendency toward the absorption of all available time in matters of scholarly and theological interest at the expense of matters of practical necessity, an affectionate management. Conducted without complaint, and with the patience of someone who has understood for some time that the impractical man she loves is not going to change, and that the alternatives to accepting this are worse than accepting it. She managed with the same unhurried competence she brought to the lich gate and the fallen wheel. She was not dazzling. She was not fashionable. She was not the sort of woman who arranged her appearance to communicate anything in particular about herself, because she was not, I would come to understand, in the habit of communicating anything she did not mean to communicate. She had a steady brown gaze that went a little too long sometimes, pausing on things rather than sliding past them, pausing on the cockerel, on the conversation, on me when I said something she was evaluating. In the way you pause on a text, you are reading carefully rather than skimming. And she had a way of thinking before she spoke that made you feel, uneasily, that whatever came next would be the accurate version of the idea rather than the convenient one. I have since learned that this was simply her habit of mind, and not any particular judgment about the people she spoke to. But in that first conversation, I found it slightly unsettling in the specific way of someone who is not accustomed to being listened to, and is now being listened to with unusual quality. It is a remarkable quality, in my experience, and rarer than it ought to be. One encounters it occasionally in very good scholars and in very good clergymen and in certain people who have managed, through whatever combination of disposition and circumstance, to preserve the habit of attention into adulthood, when everything around them is insisting that skimming is more efficient. Elspeth Crane had preserved it completely. The cockerel pointed east. The rain gentled into a gray drizzle that was not particularly worth avoiding. We stood in the lich gate for 19 minutes by my pocket watch. I noted the time without meaning to, with the part of my mind that always noted things without asking permission. And in those 19 minutes, she told me, without any apparent self-consciousness, that she was cataloging the parish burial records back to 1641, because the previous vicar had let the indexing lapse for 40 years. That she was teaching herself Latin because several of the older entries were in Latin, and she did not see the sense in waiting for someone else to translate them for her, and that the cockerel weather vane had a slightly bent left tail feather that she had asked the blacksmith to look at, but that the blacksmith maintained did not affect the instrument's function. An argument she found technically defensible, but aesthetically irritating. "You are teaching yourself Latin," I said. "From what text?" "A grammar I found in my father's boxes," she said, "and a medieval devotional someone left in the church in 1803, which is very pious but somewhat limited in vocabulary. One can become quite conversant in Latin penitence, and rather less so in Latin property disputes." "The property disputes are in a different register," I agreed. "More Cicero than Augustine." She turned to look at me then, a quick, specific look, the look of someone who has heard an unexpected reference land in an unexpected place. "Do you read them?" she said. "Cicero's legal speeches." "I read most things," I said. "My father had the habit of reading and passed it to me before he died. It is the inheritance I value most." I said it without thinking, which was unusual, and I noted the unusualness the way I had noted the time. "That is a very fine thing to say," she said, not with flattery, with the tone of someone who means it precisely. The rain stopped. She picked up her basket and looked at me with the look, brown and steady and without any calculation, and said, "Thank you for the shelter, your grace," as if I had constructed the lich gate myself. I told her, without meaning to, that I had a Roman history in my library that included a quite serviceable grammatical appendix, and that she was welcome to borrow it if she wished. She considered this for a moment with the deliberateness she brought to everything. "That is very kind," she said. "I will ask my father to call." And then the rain stopped entirely and she went across the churchyard with her basket unhurried, and I untied my horse and rode back toward the hall and found myself, somewhere on the East Lane, turning the phrase, a medieval devotional, very pious but limited in vocabulary, over in my mind, and wondering what she would make of the appendix. She came the following Thursday with her father, and I showed them both the library. Reverend Crane was a man of genuine and wide-ranging scholarship who had, it was clear, made certain sacrifices, one of which was proximity to a large and well-stocked library, for the sake of the Aldmere living, and who now found himself in the Aldmere library looking at my shelves with the expression of a man who has arrived home after a very long journey. He moved along the shelves as though he could not quite help it, running a finger along the spines with the reverence particular to those who love books as objects as well as ideas. I talked parish affairs with him for an hour, and the drainage dispute, and the Eastfield boundary. He was interested in the historical record of such things, and offered without solicitation that the parish records contained a land transaction from 1703 that might bear on the question of the original easement. We agreed that he would bring the relevant volume on his next visit. While I talked with the Reverend, Elspeth moved carefully along the far shelves with the contained focus of someone who has been given 30 minutes in a room they have always wanted to enter and intends to use every minute of it well. She did not ask permission to look at things. She simply looked at them with a quiet seriousness that was not rudeness, but its opposite, a respect for the books themselves that meant she would not pretend to be somewhere else when she was here. When her father rose to leave, she had 3 books in her arms. "One of those is the Roman history," I said. Yes, she looked at the other 2 with a slight expression that suggested she had been reasoning with herself and not entirely winning. "And Gibbon. And a natural history of the county that I thought might help with the churchyard survey. I have been trying to understand the soil variation in the east section, and whether it accounts for the poor state of the stone preservation in that area, and the natural history has a chapter on the local limestone that might bear on it." "The Gibbon is the 1776 edition," I said, "the first volume." "I know," she said. "I will not dog-ear it." "I know you will not," I said. I did not know this. I had known her for 3 weeks and 19 minutes in a Lichgate. But I said it with complete certainty because I was entirely certain it was true. She returned the books in a fortnight, brought 2 more that she had identified from the catalogue I kept in the front of the library register, and left a page of notes inside the Gibbon about a passage in Chapter 7 that she had found inconsistent with a primary source she had encountered in the burial records. The note was written on a page from one of her father's old sermon notebooks. The margins of the sermon were still visible, her notes overwritten perpendicular in her small, even hand, and she had apparently not registered that this was slightly irregular, which suggested she had written the note in the ordinary course of her thinking and placed it in the book without reflecting overmuch on what she was doing. I did not notice the notes until I was halfway through a fire-lit evening with a glass of Madeira, having picked up the Gibbon to check a reference. I read them once, quickly. Then I set my Madeira down and read them again slowly, because her argument was careful and specific, and was, upon examination, correct. Gibbon had used a secondary source in that passage, where the primary source told a different story, and she had found the primary source in the parish records, of all places, where it had been embedded in a transcription made by a 17th-century vicar who was recording local oral tradition, and had caught, in passing, an account that predated Gibbon's reference by 40 years. Her argument was right. I should have left it there. Any sensible duke would have left it there, and perhaps mentioned it in passing to her father at the next parish visit. I wrote her a note. It was, in retrospect, the first stone of an avalanche, but it looked at the time like what it said it was. 3 lines about a historiographical point, addressed to Miss Crane at the Aldmere Vicarage, sent with the Morning Post because I had a point to make and she was the person who had raised it. She replied in 4 lines with a counter-example she had found since. A tertiary source, not one she had originally cited, which she had encountered by accident while looking for something else and which further complicated the picture. I replied in 8. She replied in 12 and added a small ink sketch of the weather-vane cockerel in the margin, apparently in the spirit of illustration. She had mentioned the direction of the wind in her argument as a reference to the date she had been in the archive, and the sketch was, I supposed, clarifying the instrument's reading that day. It was also entirely unexpected, and there was something in the small, defiant poise of the ink cockerel, the bent tail feather included, that was exactly her, and I laughed. Alone in my study, over a letter from a vicar's daughter about a footnote in Gibbon, I laughed in a way that I had not laughed in longer than I could easily account for. My mother did not know about the notes. There was no reason she should. They came through the regular parish post in their own envelopes, and Elspeth was sensible enough, sensible or simply uncalculating, to address them to me directly rather than to the household because they were not household business. I was not hiding them. I told myself clearly and with some firmness that I was not hiding them. I was simply conducting a private correspondence on historiographical matters with a woman who happened to live in the vicarage. By Christmas, the correspondence was running to weekly letters of considerable length, and I was doing something I had never precisely done before, looking forward to Thursdays, when the post came up from the village before noon, and when there was, more often than not, a letter from Elspeth Crane with the small, even hand and the slightly more chaotic margins where she had got excited about a point. I looked forward to the particular weight of a letter that had ideas in it. I looked forward to what she would notice. She noticed things at a tilt to what everyone else noticed, as though she stood at a slight angle to the world, and so the light fell differently. In November, she had written me 3 paragraphs about the way the church tower cast its shadow across the south section of the churchyard in the late afternoon, and how that shadow corresponded with a visible variation in the grass growth, which in turn corresponded with a period of intensive burial between 1665 and 1668, which she suspected was plague-related, and was attempting to confirm from the county records. It was not a letter about plague, exactly. It was a letter about paying attention, about the way everything leaves a mark if you look at the right angle. I read it twice, and then a third time. In December, she wrote me about a child in the village who had taken to leaving small stones in the church porch, 1 stone each Sunday. She had noticed the pattern first and then the child, a boy of 8 whose grandfather had been buried in October and who had no other language for his grief. She had not confronted him about it, she wrote. She had simply left a slightly larger stone beside his one Sunday and smiled at him when he came in and let the accumulation build. The stones were still there, she noted. She counted them each week. She thought of them as a kind of calendar. The letter contained more practical human understanding than I had encountered in a year of London society, where everyone's grief was performed and everyone's observation was strategic. I read it in the evening, and then I sat for a long time with it in my hand, thinking about what it meant to pay that quality of attention to a boy with stones in a church porch, when you had a parish to manage and a father's correspondence to handle and Latin to teach yourself from a medieval devotional. I wrote back. I said more than I had intended to say. The year turned. She came to the hall in January to return a map she had borrowed for the churchyard survey, an estate survey from the 1740s that had detailed elevations across the whole of the Aldmere grounds, including the churchyard that was technically parish rather than ducal property, but had been surveyed at the same time because the drains ran together. I met her in the entrance hall myself. Heron, my butler, was unwell with a winter cold, and the footman who answered the door was new and uncertain of protocols, and so I happened to be crossing the hall when she was shown in. She wore the gray pelisse again and had her hat in her hand because the day was not quite cold enough for hats, and she had apparently decided it was more trouble than it was worth. She was carrying the map in its case under one arm and the accounts basket over the other because she had been on other calls before this one, and she looked, as she always looked, entirely herself, entirely uncalculated, entirely at ease in a ducal entrance hall, despite the ducal entrance hall's very deliberate suggestions about who belonged in it. I have brought the survey back, she said, and I wanted to mention there is something I found in the estate annex records that you may want to know about. The annex records, I said. She had been in my library. She had been reading the estate annex volume of 1691. She had connected it to a tenant dispute she had heard about through the parish, through calling, presumably on Wicket, who went to the church, as nearly all the village went to the church. I said, you had better come in. She looked at the estate records for 20 minutes in the library, with the survey spread on the table beside the 1691 volume and the map from 1740 open at the relevant sheet, and she showed me the discrepancy with the same precision she brought to everything. The Southfield wall as surveyed in 1691 was here. My grandfather's written account of the same wall said it was here, 12 feet north, which changed the drainage easement in a way that entirely explained why Wicket believed his easement extended further than Harrow believed it did. Wicket was right. He was right because he was drawing on a memory that was itself drawing on an older memory, the 1691 position, not my grandfather's account. My grandfather had been wrong, or had noted the wall position after a boundary shift he had failed to record, or had simply been imprecise in the way of a man who trusted his own knowledge and did not think to anchor it in a document. So the drainage easement, I said. Is Wicket's, she said, Or at least it is 12 feet further than you thought it was. My solicitor has been wrong about this for 6 weeks. Your solicitor, she said with great courtesy, has not had access to the 1691 Annex volume. We stood over the library table with the maps between us, and the January light came through the tall windows and lay across her hands, which were cold. It was January, and she had not put her gloves back on after removing her hat, and cold was the natural result. She had an ink stain on her left forefinger that she had not fully succeeded in removing. The 17th century burial records were in a hand that required ink in some quantity to copy. She had explained once, and the ink had opinions about her forefinger. The wall was here, she said, her finger moving across the map, in 1691. Your grandfather's account says here, the discrepancy is 12 feet, and the question is which version to apply to the current easement. The earlier one, I said. If Wicket has been farming on the assumption of the 1691 boundary, which he has, his grandfather farmed it before him, and his grandfather's grandfather. That is what I thought, she said, but it is your estate, not mine. No, I agreed, but you found it. Thank you. She glanced up from the map. The look was brief, but there was something in it that I recognized as not surprise exactly, more like the quiet acknowledgement of something received. Then she went back to the map and pointed to something about the east drain. I was not, in that moment, thinking about the east drain. I was thinking about the angle of her jaw in the winter light, and the ink stain, and the particular quality of attention she brought to whatever she was attending to, the stones in the church porch, the dead wool of the Gibbon footnote, the 1691 drainage survey, the boy with his grandfather's grief in his hands. The quality of a person who finds things important without being told to find them important, without any social signal that importance is the appropriate response. I had been in a great many rooms with a great many people in 26 years, and I knew how rare that quality was. I did not say any of this. I walked her to the door when she left, which was, for a duke, a degree of courtesy beyond what was strictly required, and I went back to my study and sat with my letter to the solicitor about the Wicket matter and could not write a word of it for 20 minutes. Then I wrote it in 10, in a clarity I had not had about the matter for 6 weeks, and sent it with the afternoon post. Spring came slowly that year. The drainage dispute resolved itself in Wicket's favor once the document was produced, to nobody's surprise except Harrow's, who subsided into a grumble that was, at least, a quieter one. The correspondence with Elspeth continued. In March she wrote me about St. Augustine's view of time. She had found a fragment of the Confessions in the bottom of a box of her father's books that had evidently been there long enough to develop a particular relationship with the other books in the box. And her letter was 4 pages about the nature of eternity, and how it seemed to her, when she tried to think about it, that eternity must feel like a very long Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday afternoons, she had written, are when the parish is quiet enough that I can actually think. The morning visits are done, and the evening duties are not yet begun, and the house is still, and there is the sense that time is very slightly more cooperative than it usually is, as if it has agreed to slow down slightly while no one is watching. I think eternity must be something like that, but without the edge of the sun moving. I wrote back about Augustine and Boethius, and the letter went to 4 pages itself, which I noted with a faint surprise when I counted them before folding and sealing. I had not intended 4 pages when I sat down, and had somehow written them. I thought about Tuesday afternoons differently ever since reading her letter. I thought about them as time that had agreed to slow down. In April she mentioned, very briefly, that a curate from the neighboring parish had been visiting her father rather frequently on matters of pastoral exchange, and that her father had expressed satisfaction with the visits. She did not say what she thought of the curate. She did not say whether she had met him. She said only that the visits were frequent, and that her father was satisfied, and then moved on to the question of a 16th-century Latin charter she had located in the county records that appeared to be connected to the original Aldmere grant, and whether I would like her to transcribe it. I would very much like the transcription, I replied, and then after 2 drafts I said, I hope the curate's visits are enjoyable for all parties. Then I crossed out the second sentence, because it was too much, and wrote only the first and sent it. I read the sentence in her next letter 3 times, trying to determine whether the curate was in it for the sake of information or for some other purpose, and concluded that I was being foolish and that I had no standing to have an opinion about the curate in any case, and went back to the Eastfield accounts. In May, I rode past the church on a Tuesday and found her on a ladder in the churchyard, reattaching a date stone that had come loose from a 19th century memorial. The ladder was not tall, perhaps 5 rungs, and she was being sensibly careful, but she was also entirely alone, and the stone was heavier than it looked, and I had dismounted before I quite decided to dismount. "The mortar dried faster than I thought," she said, not particularly surprised to see me, as if dukes turned up regularly when she was on ladders. "The afternoon was warmer than I expected, and it began to set before I had the stone properly aligned. Could you hold the stone steady from that side while I reapply?" I held the stone. It was perhaps 8 inches by 12, carved with a name and 2 dates and a small cross, and it wanted to slide left, which was exactly what she had suspected. She applied the fresh mortar with a trowel that she had apparently brought specifically for this purpose. She had brought mortar and a trowel to a churchyard in May, which told you everything about how she moved through the world, and she applied it with confidence, with the particular confidence of someone who has done a great many things without assistance, and has learned to do them correctly rather than approximately. We replaced the stone. She came down the ladder, and I had released the stone and stepped back, and we stood in the churchyard in the May afternoon with the birds going about their business in the yew trees and the whole village moving at its Tuesday pace around us, and she said, "Thank you." And then, without any preamble, "I have been trying to work out what to do about the curate." I said, very carefully, "What seems to be the difficulty?" "He is very kind," she said. She had the trowel still in her hand and was looking at it with the look she usually saved for things she was reasoning through, the slight tilt of the head, the pause. "And my father likes him enormously. He is interested in the same periods of church history that my father is interested in, which is not common, and they can talk for hours, and it is a genuine gift for my father. And the curate himself, he is attentive, considerate. There is nothing wrong with him." "Then what is the difficulty?" "He would be," she paused again. "Practical, I suppose, is the word. The Aldmere living is small, but it is secure, and the house will want someone to manage it when my father can no longer do so himself, and Marcus has his own difficulties in Bath, and Cecily is young yet. There would be provision and stability and a kind man who would do his best." She was still looking at the trowel. "But I think if I am to spend my whole life with someone, I ought to feel rather more than practical." I did not say the thing that rose immediately in my mind, which was entirely specific and entirely inadvisable. I was 31 years old and a duke who had been trained to manage his responses, and I managed this one. What I said was, "That seems like a sound principle." She looked at me then with those steady brown eyes, with the full Elspeth Crane look. "My father thinks I am being impractical," she said. "He would probably say that the people who feel more than practical tend to suffer more than practically, too, that the feelings which outrun common sense also outlast it." "He is not wrong," I said, "as a general observation." "No," she agreed. "But I find I would rather suffer precisely for the right reason than be comfortable for the wrong one." She said it simply and without drama, the way she stated everything that was true for her. It was not a speech. It was information. She picked up her ladder in one hand and her mortar bucket in the other, and carried them back to the church herself, because she was, as I had come to understand, the sort of person who carried what she had brought without waiting for it to be carried for her. I rode home. I sat in my study for an hour without lighting the lamps, because the evening came in gradually, and I had a letter to write and could not quite start it. Then I started it and wrote 7 pages, beginning with Boethius and ending with something else entirely, and I read it back and knew I could not send it, and I burned it in the grate. I sat with the ash for a while longer. Then I wrote 3 pages about Boethius and sent those. I should tell you about my mother's position at this time, because what she did later cannot be understood without understanding the architecture she had constructed over 30 years, and the way that architecture made her feel not like a person in opposition, but like an institution, with an institution's conviction of its own correctness. My father had died when I was 19. He was a quiet man, a scholar of antiquities in the way that is genuine rather than fashionable, who would sit in the library with a tablet inscription and a grammar, and forget entirely that dinner had been scheduled. He had loved my mother, I believe, in the way that some men love formidable women, not despite their formidableness, but because of it, because something in him recognized that the strength he lacked in the management of the world was present in her in abundance, and he was grateful for it. He had loved me with the helpless, specific love that gentle men have for their children, a love that expressed itself in afternoons in the library and the Roman history, and the habit of finding things important without being told to. When he died, the estate came to me at 19, and my mother's management came with it. She had managed the estate through his illness and through the minority with a precision that was real. The books were impeccable, the staff was organized, the social obligations were fulfilled, the neighboring families maintained at exactly the distances that served Aldmere best. She had done it without complaint and without particular credit, in the way of women who understand that management without visibility is still management, and who prefer the thing done to the thing praised. What I did not see clearly until later was that the management had a secondary purpose. The secondary purpose was permanence. My mother had made herself indispensable not from any explicit calculation, but from the accumulated habit of 7 years of having Aldmere depend on her. 7 years during which she had never stepped back from a decision, or deferred to an external opinion, or encouraged any structure that did not run through her. When I came into the dukedom, she stepped sideways without stepping away. The household was still hers. The social calendar was still hers. The correspondence that was addressed to the ducal house rather than to me personally was still hers. The decisions that could be managed quietly were managed quietly, which is to say they were managed by her. She had, at the time of which I am speaking, a candidate for my wife. She had had the candidate for some time, Lady Beatrice Holt, daughter of the Earl of Morven, who was handsome, well-connected, well-dowried, with accomplishments in the pianoforte and watercolor painting, and the correct management of conversation at a dinner table. My mother liked her very much. She expressed the approval in the particular way she expressed all approvals, not warmly but precisely. Lady Beatrice had correct feeling. Lady Beatrice understood her position. Lady Beatrice would make an excellent Duchess of Aldmere. What Lady Beatrice lacked, and I could not have told you this at the time, because I had not yet found the word for it, was the quality of presence that makes a room alive. She was attentive in the way that people who have been taught attentiveness are attentive. She listened, she nodded, she responded appropriately. But there was no argument under the listening, no thing she was working out, no observation she had made at an unexpected angle that required reconfiguring the conversation around it. She was a perfectly pleasant woman who would have made some perfectly pleasant duke a perfectly pleasant Duchess of Aldmere, and I have never blamed her for any of it, because none of it was her fault. My mother intended to manage me into the arrangement eventually. She was patient about it. She placed Lady Beatrice in the social landscape at a measured pace, a dinner here, a call there, and she watched me and waited. What she did not anticipate, because she had not been present in the Lichgate or the churchyard or over the estate maps, was that the thing she was waiting to manage had already become something that was not manageable. She became aware of the letters in August. I was in London on estate business, a matter of a trust arrangement from my grandfather's settlement that had developed a complication in the courts and required my solicitor in person. I was gone for a fortnight. The letters that I was sending to Elspeth went out with the house's outgoing post, because I had not thought to send them separately. They were what I said they were, and I had not lied about what they were to anyone, and so there was no particular reason to take special routes. They went in with the household correspondence, addressed in my own hand to Miss E. Crane at the Aldmere Vicarage, which was a direction that my mother, who oversaw the household correspondence, would recognize. The particular mechanism of her discovery I have since reconstructed, but was not present for. Whether it was a letter coming in from Elspeth addressed directly to me, that was placed on the hall table with the Morning Post before being sorted to my study. Whether it was the accumulation of outgoing envelopes addressed in my hand to the vicarage that finally drew her attention. Whether Heron, my butler, who was loyal to my mother in that absolute way that old family servants sometimes are, loyal to the institution, which in his mind meant loyal to her, mentioned the frequency of the correspondence. I do not know. What I know is that she opened at least one letter from Elspeth that was addressed to me, and that once she had read it, she understood the nature of the exchange. She went through the outgoing correspondence next. She would have been methodical about it. She was always methodical. She found the letters I had sent through the house post over the months, and she read them. I do not know how many she found, but she found enough. She found the letter in which I had told Elspeth about my father and the Roman history. She found the letter in which I had said, on the subject of the Boethius conversation, that the experience of talking to someone who genuinely thought rather than performed thinking was something I had been trying to name for some time and had not previously succeeded in naming. She found, I expect, the letter about Tuesday afternoons. What she did with what she found, I did not learn for 11 years. What I knew when I returned from London was that Elspeth had stopped writing back. Her letters stopped. August passed without a reply to the letter I had sent before I left, and I told myself she had been occupied. The harvest brought changes to the parish visiting schedule, and her father had mentioned at the last library visit that he had a diocesan meeting in the coming weeks. September came and I wrote again. No reply. October, I wrote once more, a shorter letter, asking simply if she was well and whether the indexing had progressed beyond the 1590 date she had mentioned reaching in June. No reply. I told myself the things a man tells himself when the story his vanity prefers has to account for a silence it did not expect, that she had thought better of the correspondence, that the curate from the neighboring parish had perhaps concluded his visits more decisively, that I had said something in the August letter, or in the July one, or in the earlier ones, that had given offense in a way I could not see but she could. I read the August letter again. I could not find the offense, but that proved nothing. The things that give offense are rarely the things one intends. I did not call at the vicarage. This is the thing I have spent 11 years accounting for, and I will not spare myself the accounting here. I did not go to the church, or walk up the vicarage path and knock, or send even the briefest possible note saying, "Have I offended you, and if so, how?" A duke and a vicar's daughter. There were protocols, and there was the question of her dignity if I pressed a correspondence she had chosen to end, and there was my mother in the background of everything, and there were 100 excellent reasons that amount, in retrospect, to nothing at all. The truest reason was this: I was afraid. I was afraid that if I went to the vicarage, she would be kind to me because she was always kind, and she would tell me calmly and directly that she had thought better of the correspondence, and I would have to stand in front of her and accept it, and the acceptance would be final in a way that the silence was not quite final. So I accepted the silence and told myself it was respect for her choice. In October, my mother brought Lady Beatrice Holt to Aldmere Hall for a fortnight's visit, along with Lady Beatrice's mother and a social infrastructure of calls and dinners and small parties that had clearly been organized over several weeks and with considerable forethought. I did not object. I was civil. I was not unpleasant. Lady Beatrice played the pianoforte rather well and was accomplished in conversation at a dinner table and expressed no opinions that I can now recall, and I sat across from her every evening for 2 weeks and was present in the way I had learned to be present at dinners, attentive, appropriate, managing the surface of things. And I thought, without meaning to, about an ink stain on a left forefinger and a letter about Tuesday afternoons, and whether the weather vane was pointing east or south. My mother watched me with the specific watchfulness that meant she had identified a risk and was managing it. I noticed the watchfulness and did not examine it. I only noticed later, much later, that she never mentioned Elspeth Crane once, not even in passing, not even to say she had seen the vicar at Sunday service, or that the parish burials had taken a new direction. The silence around the name was as deliberate as everything else my mother did, and as invisible while it was happening. Lady Beatrice went back to Morven in November. I spent the winter in London because the estate business required it, or I required it, or both. Even now I am not entirely certain which was the truer reason. The next 3 years are a summary rather than a narrative, because to tell them in full detail would be to dwell at length in rooms where the chief activity was the absence of what mattered most. And that is not, I think, what a man should linger over when he is trying to tell the truth. I was in London for substantial portions of each year. I was in Edinburgh for a summer, on account of a Scottish estate that had come to me through a distant cousin's will and that required inspection. The estate was a small and water-damaged affair in a part of the country that regarded the rest of England as a rumor, and the inspection was thorough and took considerably longer than I had hoped. I was in Paris once, for a month that my mother arranged by producing a letter from an old friend at the embassy who had, it turned out, been asked by my mother to produce the letter, a fact I deduced only in retrospect when I encountered a small coincidence in the timing. My mother was not unintelligent about these arrangements. She knew that proximity maintained what she wished to maintain, and that distance, while not a cure, was at least a form of management. She had always understood the management of her landscape better than I had. I had grown up in it. She had constructed it. One always understands a landscape better if one built it. What she did not account for was the particular quality of the thing she was managing. Distance does not diminish what is built on something real. It calcifies it. It makes it heavier and more precisely shaped and more precisely located, not spread vaguely across memory, the way pleasant experiences spread and blur, but fixed at exact coordinates. A lich gate in November, a library table in January, a churchyard in May, the particular quality of an afternoon in which someone has told you the truth without performing it. I could have described, in the 3rd year and the 5th year and the 8th year, the exact details of 19 minutes in a lich gate with the same clarity as the day after. I could have told you the number of books she had in her arms when she came out of the library that first Thursday. I could have told you the exact temperature of the observation about the medieval devotional and its penitent vocabulary. It is possible to know something imperfectly for years and then, when you return to the full knowledge of it, find that it has not faded at all, only weighted. I have since concluded that what waits is not the emotion, which would be difficult to sustain at full weight for years, but the form, the precise shape of the thing, preserved while the feeling around it shifts, like a mold from which something can be cast again when the material is available. I thought about Elspeth Crane with the specific persistence of a man who cannot explain why he cannot stop, and has mostly stopped trying to explain it. The explanation would have required saying to myself that I had made a serious error in October of the 1st year, had accepted a silence I should have broken, had let my mother's management stand where I should have stepped past it, and this was an admission I was not yet in the habit of making. I was a man who had been told, since the age of 12, that a duke does not second-guess his decisions. He makes decisions, and he defends them, and he moves forward, because confidence in direction is one of the things that an estate and a tenancy require of their head. The habit was correct for most of its applications. It was a poor habit when applied to the question of Elspeth Crane, because the decision I had made, the passive decision, the decision not to press, was the only one in my life that I was not able to defend on any ground I found satisfactory. The London seasons came and went. I danced and dined and fulfilled every social obligation and declined, with great quietness and regularity, to become engaged to any of the women my mother produced. She produced several, with the patience of a woman who believes that the correct arrangement, offered sufficient times, will eventually be accepted. I have spoken already of Lady Beatrice Holt, who came to the hall in October of the 1st year. In the 2nd year there was a Miss Farrell, who had an excellent complexion and a pleasant manner, and talked about music with a fluency that reminded me, inconveniently, of nothing at all, because Elspeth had not talked about music but about everything else, and the reminder was of the shape of the gap rather than its filling. In the 3rd year there were 2 introductions, both arranged through my mother's network with the precision of a military campaign. The elder daughter of the Viscount Hatch, and a young widow from a naval family whom my mother had encountered at Bath and found suitable. I do not wish to speak unkindly of any of them. They were, without exception, pleasant and accomplished women who deserved to marry men who were present in the room with them, who could think about them without their minds sliding sideways to the sentence. I would rather suffer precisely for the right reason than be comfortable for the wrong one, spoken in a May churchyard without any awareness of what it was doing to the man who heard it. I could not be that man for any of them. I declined. My mother grew quieter and more architectural with each passing season, and the walls grew taller. She developed in these years a particular expression when I declined another suitable match, a kind of composed, studied patience that contained within it something that was not quite grief and not quite judgment, and was, I think, very close to fear. She was a woman of great certainty, and the thing she was most certain about was the importance of Aldmere continuing correctly, and I was placing that certainty at risk by my refusal, year after year, to do the obvious and necessary thing. She saw it as carelessness. She could not have seen it as what it was, because she had ensured that she was the only person who knew the full shape of what it was, and so she could not see the shape. She could only see the refusal, which looked, from the outside, exactly like what she had always feared. Her son making an irreducible error that no management could correct. There were evenings in those London years when I would arrive home from a dinner and find that I had spent 3 hours being a duke, being the version of myself that society required, which was correct and appropriate and entirely without the quality I was calling in my private vocabulary presence. And I would sit in my rooms with a book I was not reading and understand, very clearly, that the thing I was managing to avoid feeling most of the time was that I had let something happen that should not have happened, and that the something was irretrievable, and that I was going to have to live in that fact. Then I would go to bed and get up in the morning and manage the estate and be the Duke, because what else was available? I understand her better now than I did in those years, my mother, I mean. I understand that she loved me in her way, which was the love of a person who has built something and cannot stop tending it, who has sacrificed a very great deal for the thing she has built, and whose fear of its unraveling has become, over time, indistinguishable from the love itself. I understand that the interception of the letters was, for her, an act of maintenance rather than cruelty. She would have called it correction, a realignment of something that had drifted dangerously from its proper course. She believed she was right. She believed it with the completeness that people believe things they have never been required to test against an opposing view, because the opposing view had been locked in a cedar box before it could be heard. None of this is forgiveness. It is only understanding, which comes more easily with time and which does not require the thing understood to have been right. In the 8th year after the correspondence, I returned to Aldmere Hall for a stay of several weeks. The east wing roof had developed an opinion about the autumn rain that the estate accounts were now required to address, the opinion being that it wished to let the rain in, which was an opinion the east wing had been forming for some time, but had only recently committed to expressing with full conviction. There was also a new drainage scheme in the south field that had grown out of the Wicket matter. Wicket had died, and his son had inherited the acreage and the easement. And young Wicket had ideas about the easement's interpretation that required attention from the landowner in person rather than from a solicitor's letter, because young Wicket was, like his father, a man who trusted the evidence of his own eyes over any document written by someone who had not stood on the ground. I came back in late summer, intending a fortnight and staying 6 weeks. The hall itself felt, as it always felt when I returned from London, slightly larger than I remembered it, as if the absence had given it room to expand. The rooms were as they had been. The library was as it had been. The reading desk by the east window still had the mark on its surface where someone had set a damp cup in. I had always meant to have it refinished, and had never quite got to it. And it was still there, and the familiarity of it was, on that first evening back, unexpectedly comfort. The village had altered in the small specific ways that 8 years alter a place. A house repainted in a brighter color that the owner clearly felt good about. A hedgerow grown out along the north lane and then cut back too severely, leaving it looking startled. The posting in with a new sign that spelled the inn's name slightly differently from the old one, which may have been the new owner's preference or may have been a sign painter's initiative. The church was as it had been, which is the particular constancy of churches. They hold their shape against time in a way that other buildings do not, as if they have made an agreement with the centuries and intend to honor it. Reverend Crane had grown older in 8 years, as people do, but he had grown older in the direction of himself rather than away from it. He was more settled in his enthusiasms, more visibly at ease in the living he had inhabited, more patently loved by the parish that he had loved in return for 8 years without interruption. He greeted me at the Sunday service of my first week back with the warm, slightly vague pleasure of a man who is genuinely glad to see you, and is not quite certain where you have been, but is glad you are here now. On a Tuesday, it was always Tuesdays with her, as if time itself had organized the coincidences for its own reasons. I came to the church to speak with the new curate about the Eastfield boundary record that the previous vicar had kept in the church safe since the 1780s. The new curate was a different man from the one she had mentioned 8 years ago. This one had arrived 2 years prior and was a brisk young man who kept excellent records and was deeply practical about everything that could be addressed practically, which made him very useful and somewhat at odds with Reverend Crane, who tended toward the impractical, but who had developed over 8 years a deep affection for the young curate's compensating strengths. I was there for perhaps 40 minutes, in the vestry and then the nave, examining the boundary record and making notes that would become, eventually, part of the argument I would make to young Wicket, and that young Wicket would accept on the third presentation. She was in the side aisle. She was teaching a class of 6 village children in the side aisle, with a slate board propped against the end of the pew and a set of illustrated cards she had made herself. I could see they were handmade from the slight variations in the lettering, neat, and even but not printed. She was teaching letters, it appeared, and numbers, and the children were at the age where these things are still new enough to be interesting, between 4 and 7 or 8. She had one boy on her knee who was too young for the class, the child of someone who could not be left, probably, and he was following the lesson with the total absorption of a person who has no idea what he is doing, but is committed to the doing of it. She looked up when I stopped in the church doorway. What moved across her face was there long enough that I was quite certain it was not my imagination. It was something complex, something that was not surprise, because she had known I was in the county. News travels in a village, and the Duke returning to the hall is news. It was not alarm, because she was Elspeth Crane, and alarm was not her register. It was something older and more complicated than either. The kind of thing a face does when it encounters something it had arranged to stop expecting, and now must rearrange itself around. Then the boy on her knee pulled at her sleeve and pointed at the slate board, and she looked down and looked back up at me and gave me the public Elspeth Crane smile, pleasant, warm, unhurried, and sealed as a letter with wax, and turned back to the lesson. I sat on the nearest pew at the back of the nave and waited. When the children left, she gathered her illustrated cards and stacked them and tapped the edges even, with the particular economy she brought to all small tasks, and then she came up the aisle toward me. She was 31 now, and in a dove-gray gown that was better than the gray pelisse of her first arriving year, but still without any particular attention paid to fashion, and her hair was still braided and looped without artifice, and she was exactly herself, which was the thing that was most difficult to account for. That 8 years had not changed the essential quality of her, only settled it, the way good furniture settles into its grain. "Your Grace," she said, "welcome back to Aldmere." She set the little boy on his feet and pointed him toward the door with a word, and he went, as children went when Elspeth Crane pointed them somewhere without argument. "Miss Crane," I said, "you are teaching the village children." "The school has been running for 3 years," she said, as if I might have heard and forgotten. "We started with 4 pupils and have 16 now. The side aisle on Tuesdays and Thursdays is supplemented by the old stable room at the vicarage, which my father no longer uses for anything else." "I did not know," I said. "No," she said without reproach, "you have not been in residence." I should have begun something then. The thing I had avoided beginning for 8 years was there in the air between us, waiting, the way avoided things wait, not impatiently, because they have been waiting long enough to have learned patience, but with the specific weight of presence. I should have said, "I do not understand why the correspondence ended." I should have said, "I wrote twice in August and heard nothing." I should have said, most simply, "I have thought about Tuesdays differently ever since a letter you wrote me in March." What I said was, "Miss Crane, I have wondered sometimes whether I gave offense in the correspondence. I know that you chose not to continue it, and I have not wished to press the matter. But if something," I said. She went very still, not the stillness of someone at rest, the stillness of someone who has just heard something that does not fit the architecture. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The letters," I said. "You stopped replying. I wrote twice more in August after I returned from London. I assumed you had chosen not to continue the correspondence. I only wondered if I had said something." "I stopped replying," she said, with a flatness that was not rude but was very precise, "is a phrase I do not quite understand because it implies I made a decision." I looked at her, she looked at me. "I did not receive any letters from you in August," she said. "After you went to London, I received one letter in July about the Augustan reforms, and there was a passage about the correspondence of Pliny that connected to something you had mentioned in June, and then nothing." She paused. "And then someone told me that you had decided the correspondence was not appropriate, and I took it as I took it." Someone told her. The specific cold clarity of something long obscured arriving at the light. "Who told you," I said, "that I had decided the correspondence was not appropriate?" A pause not short. "Your mother," she said. She said it very carefully, as if handling something that might not hold. "She called at the vicarage, in September of that year. She was kind about it. She said you had given it a great deal of consideration and that you wished me to know you valued the correspondence and wished me well." She said you wished me well. The exact words my mother would have chosen. I know because I knew her, because she was the architect of this entire structure, and the structure was built with her precision. Kind, correct, leaving no point of argument. A young woman of no position and no fortune could not argue with a duchess who had been kind to her. A young woman who had already guessed that the correspondence might have meant more to her than it had been intended to mean, could not argue with a duchess who was giving her a graceful exit. My mother had given her the graceful exit on my behalf, and Elspeth had taken it because she had no reason to believe it was not what it was presented as. I stood in the nave of the church at Aldmere for a considerable time. The afternoon light moved through the high windows on the south side and fell across the worn stone floor in bars, the way it always had, as if the centuries were entirely indifferent to what happened under the light. Outside, the weather-vane cockerel moved in the August wind. I could hear it from the nave, a faint, slightly stiff creak that meant the bearing wanted oil, which it had wanted for some time, I thought, and which no one had attended to. The bent left tail feather was visible from here, against the sky, when I turned my head, still bent. "She called at the vicarage," I said. "Yes." "And told you I did not wish to continue the correspondence." "Yes." "And wished you well on my behalf." "Yes," she said, and the slight flatness was still in her voice, very controlled, very exact. She had always been controlled. It was one of the things I had admired about her before I had understood it clearly enough to name it. The way the control was not the suppression of emotion, but the management of its expression. The discipline of a person who has strong feeling and a firm conviction that strong feeling, unmanaged, does not serve the people around you. My mother had the same quality, I thought, and the comparison struck me as both obvious and odd, and I set it aside. "She intercepted the letters," I said. I said it aloud, for myself as much as for her, because I needed to hear the sentence and know that it was the right sentence, that I was not constructing something convenient from ambiguous evidence. "The letters I sent in August, and the ones I sent in September, and very likely others I had believed sent and answered only with silence. She found them in the outgoing post. She oversaw the household correspondence. She had always overseen it. It was part of the management of the house. She found them and she did not send them. And then she came to you herself and told you I had ended the correspondence." "That is what it appears," she said. She was standing very still, not the stillness of someone at rest, but the stillness of someone who is thinking very precisely, the way she thought when a problem required full attention, all the resources gathered inward and applied, nothing wasted. I had seen this stillness over the estate maps. I had seen it over the 1691 annex record. I had never seen it applied to a problem that was also, in a large part, about her. "8 years," she said, very quietly, not accusation, notation. "Yes," I said, 8 years. The nave was very quiet. Outside, a pair of sparrows were disputing something in the yew tree beside the south wall, and the argument was brief and decisive, and settled in the way that bird arguments settle, one party departing, the other remaining, the yew tree entirely indifferent to the outcome. The cockerel turned another quarter turn and creaked. I should have been angry. I was, underneath, very angry, in the specific cold way that I had inherited from the Stanhope side of the family. The anger that does not perform itself but sits in the room like a stone and makes a room smaller. But the anger was not the primary thing in the moment. The primary thing was Elspeth Crane standing across from me in the church where she had been teaching children their letters for 3 years, and 31 years old, and the specific weight of the time between us that my mother had managed into existence. 8 years was not an abstract quantity. 8 years was the distance between 23 and 31, between the woman who had carried Gibbon and the natural history out of the library on a Thursday and the woman who had built a school in the vicarage stable. It was not nothing. It had not been nothing to her, and it had not been nothing to me, and it was not recoverable. "Miss Crane," I said. Elspeth. It was the first time I had said her given name aloud, though I had thought it privately in approximately the same way one thinks of a word that describes something correctly and returns to it again and again. What I felt in those months of the correspondence, I should have said it then. I should not have let August pass without coming to you directly. I know that. I did not, and I stopped. There is not an adequate word. She was looking at me with the full Elspeth Crane look, steady and long, seeing the thing clearly. "How many letters did she take?" she said. "I don't know. I sent 2 in August that I know she took. I may have sent more in September and October that. I had come to believe they had been received and not answered, and I did not want to press. I wrote 3, she said, in August, before I concluded that there was no use. She said it without accusation. She was reporting, as she always reported, the accurate version of events. 3 letters, I said. Yes, and then in September and October and into the winter, perhaps 8 or 10 altogether before I stopped. She had kept writing, 8 or 10 letters, into silence that she believed was deliberate, and she had kept writing because she could not quite bring herself to stop. And my mother had met each one and brought them to the solicitor and locked them away, and come back to the vicarage to be kind about it. I would like, I said, when I had command of my voice again, to begin again, if you would consider it. She looked at her hands. They were folded in front of her, and the left forefinger had the ink stain still, a different ink, 8 years on, but in exactly the same place, which told you something about the habits of a person who works closely and consistently with ink. I would need time, she said. Yes, and I would not wish to be managed, she said. It was as direct as everything she said, and it landed exactly as directly. Your mother is. My mother, I said, is 82 years old and in indifferent health, and has not in the last several years had either the energy or the standing to manage anything that I do not permit her to manage. The letters, wherever they are, I intend to find them. You may not find them, she said. She may have destroyed them. She may have, I said, but my mother does not destroy things. My mother archives. She believes in the importance of record. It is how she manages. She keeps everything because everything kept is evidence, and evidence is the instrument of management. She was quiet for a moment, thinking in the way she thought, with her whole attention turned on the problem. Then I will consider it, she said at last, beginning again. I walked out of the church into the August afternoon with the particular quality of feeling that comes with arriving, after a very long time, at something you had stopped believing you would ever arrive at. Not joy exactly, that was too simple, too unmixed. Joy and grief together, the grief for the time and the joy that the story was not what it had appeared, that she had written letters, that she had not chosen to stop. I went back to the hall and found my mother in the drawing room with her embroidery, because she was always in the drawing room with her embroidery in the late afternoon of August days, and I sat down across from her and told her, in the direct and unarchitectural manner I had been learning to use, that I had spoken with Miss Crane, and that I was aware of what she had done in the summer 8 years past. She set down the embroidery. She looked at me with a watchfulness. I did what was necessary, she said. You deceived both of us, I said. You took my correspondence and hers, and you told her I had ended the correspondence, and you told her I wished her well. You did not know what you wished, she said. You were 26 and in correspondence with a young woman who had no position and no prospects and no connection of any kind that could serve Aldmere. You did not understand what you were doing. I understood exactly what I was doing, I said. I had understood for some months. Then you understood recklessly, she said. There was no apology in her voice. There was not the smallest suggestion of apology. Aldmere required. Aldmere, I said, has survived quite adequately for the past 11 years under the current arrangements. What it has not had under the current arrangements is a duchess. What I have not had is the woman I should have married 8 years ago. These are consequences of your management, not requirements of the estate. She was quiet for a long time. The embroidery sat on the table beside her, a thing she had been making for years that never seemed to be finished, an excess of tiny flowers in pale wool. Your father would have said something similar, she said at last. I know, I said. He was generally right. She did not say anything else. She picked up the embroidery and put down the embroidery. She looked at the window. You intend to marry her, she said. I intend to ask her. Whether she agrees is her decision. She will agree, my mother said. She is not stupid. It was the closest she came, that day, to a compliment. I took it for what it was. Finding the letters was not dramatic. It was the work of several weeks, methodical and patient, conducted in the same manner I managed everything about the estate that required patience without performance. My mother did not help. She did not prevent either, which from her was a form of permission. She remained in the drawing room with her embroidery and observed and said nothing, and I searched the house with the help of Mr. Arden, my butler, who had been with the household for 6 years, and who was loyal in the way I required loyalty. to me, not to the management of me. In September, 3 weeks after the conversation in the church, Mr. Arden came to my study in the late morning with an expression that was controlled in the way of a man who is carrying something significant and knows that the carrying matters more than the reaction. He told me that in the course of the reorganization of the North Wing storage, which had been underway since July on account of some damp in the upper shelving, the housemaid had found a locked cedar box on the highest shelf of the room that adjoined my mother's dressing room. He had brought it to my study before proceeding further. It was small, perhaps 18 inches long, 12 wide. The brass lock was old but well-maintained, which told you something. The estate locksmith opened it the following morning in 10 minutes with a set of picks that he handled with the professional calm of a man who had opened many locks and had no interest in whatever was inside them. I waited until he was gone. Then I opened the box. There were 47 letters inside, tied in 2 bundles with the estate's standard cord, the kind used for bundling correspondence. My mother had organized them. The first bundle was in my handwriting, 23 letters, spanning from August of the correspondence year through the following spring. The second bundle was in Elspeth's hand, 24 letters, in the small, even script I knew as well as I knew the weather-vane cockerel, slightly more chaotic in the parts where she had got excited about a point. I sat with the box open in front of me for a while before I touched the letters. The morning light was coming in through the study windows, and Mr. Arden had closed the door when he left, and the room was very quiet. The cedar box smelled of the cedar and faintly of something else, old paper and ink, the particular smell of letters that have been folded and stored, that have been living in the dark. Then I read them all. Mine first, the 2 I had sent in August, which I remembered sending and had always known existed, the letter about the Augustan reforms in July, which I remembered, and then 9 other letters in my hand that I did not entirely recognize as things I had sent, because I could not account for the gap between what I remembered sending and what I found here. 3 letters that I had apparently written in September and October, and had believed I had sent through the house post. The September letter about the drainage matter resolving itself in Wicket's favor, and the October letter about the Edinburgh plans, and a third that was not about practical things at all, but about what I had been reading. 2 long letters from January that I had written in the library on late evenings, and placed on the hall table with the Morning Post and not thought about again, because I had thought about them as sent. 4 more across the winter and spring, including one in February about Boethius's concept of providence, and whether it could be reconciled with the experience of standing in a lich gate in November rain not knowing what you were standing at the beginning of, which was perhaps the most unguarded letter I had ever written in my life, and which I had apparently forgotten existed because I had received no answer to it, and had told myself it was among the ones she had chosen not to answer. I had not written 11 letters and received silence for 8 of them. I had written 23 letters. She had received 3. My mother had taken 20 letters that I had believed were sent and answered with silence. She had taken them and paid 12 shillings to have them stored in a cedar box and placed on a high shelf in the room beside her dressing room, where she could, if she chose, unlock the box and read them whenever she wished, which I thought she had done, because the bundles were too neatly organized to have been stored once and never touched. I sat with that for quite some time. The fire in the study grate had gone low. I had not thought to add to it when the locksmith left, and the morning was cooling, and I sat with my own letters in my hand and understood that I had been living for 8 years in a story that was not the story. I had been living in the story in which Elspeth had read my August letters and chosen not to reply, and in which my mother's September visit to the vicarage had been a kindness rather than a management, and in which the silence was Elspeth's answer and I had been correct to accept it. None of that story was true. The true story was in the cedar box, in 23 letters I had written and 47 letters altogether, and the true story was what it had always been, only I had not been permitted to live in it. Then I read Elspeth's, 24 letters from August of the correspondence year through the following March. The first 4 were relatively brief, the August letters, in which she was still in the habit of the correspondence, and wrote as she always wrote, about what she was reading and thinking and doing, with the weather vane and the children and the Latin and the 1591 burial records. The 5th was a little shorter, and had a quality of hesitation in it that I would not have recognized before these months, but recognized now. the quality of a person who has noticed that their letters are not being answered and is adjusting their expectations by degrees. By the 6th letter in October, she was writing with the slightly different quality of someone who has been told a thing and is not entirely persuaded of it. She did not say that my mother had called at the vicarage. She wrote instead about the indexing, which had reached 1574, and about the curate, who had apparently left the county. There was a single sentence about it, matter of fact, no emotion, and about the natural history of the county, and whether the limestone had had a measurable effect on the burial record in the east section. She wrote in the letter about Augustine, again, because she was reading the confessions properly now, not the fragment from the box, but a full edition she had found at the county book sale, and there was a passage she had been thinking about that had to do with restlessness and arrival. She did not say why she was thinking about it. By November, her letters were shorter, and the handwriting was more even throughout. The chaos in the margins had quieted, which was the sign of a person who is being careful. By December, they were shorter still, and by January and February they were precise and contained and had the quality of letters written with full knowledge that they would not be answered but written anyway, because the alternative was more difficult. The last one from March was the shortest. It said, "I cannot continue to write letters that receive no answer. This is not reproach, or rather it is reproach, but only for myself for continuing as long as I have. I expect you had your reasons. I expect they were sufficient. I expect from the nature of the correspondence that they were not arrived at lightly, and that what was done with care for everyone involved. And that is, it is a correct way to manage such things, and I understand it, and I do not wish to make the management of it more difficult by persisting. I will think of Tuesdays differently." That was all. I sat with the letter for a very long time. The afternoon moved around me, and the light changed, and I did not move with it. I thought about all the Tuesdays between March of that year and the August afternoon in the church when I had finally learned the truth, and how many of them she had spent thinking about Tuesdays differently, and whether differently meant what I thought it meant. Then I went to find her. She was at the school building, the room she had built onto the south side of the old vicarage stable 3 years ago, where she taught the village children, and on Thursday evenings, a class of adult women from the village and the surrounding farms who had missed their schooling. I had learned this from Arden, who learned it from the housekeeper, who was from the village originally and went to the Thursday class herself. I waited in the lane until the afternoon session had ended and the children had dispersed, which I knew because I could hear them. She opened the door when I knocked. She looked at my face and then at the cedar box under my arm, and the look she gave them both was the same look she had given the 1691 estate record when she understood what it meant. "You found them," she said. 47 letters, I said, 23 of mine and 24 of yours. She stepped back and let me in. The schoolroom was low-ceilinged and warm, with the afternoon light coming through 2 windows on the east wall, and the day's lesson still on the slate board in her handwriting, multiplication, and a list of county market towns with their distances from Aldmere. There was a map of the county on the far wall, with a small notation at the churchyard boundary in her hand that I could see from across the room was connected to the burial survey. The room smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the particular slight mustiness of children in autumn. She sat down at one of the children's desks, which was the only chair the room contained besides the teacher's chair, and she sat in it without comment despite it being somewhat too small, because she was Elspeth Crane, and she had never in her life complained about a practical inconvenience. I sat at the teacher's table. I set the cedar box between us. 24 of these are yours, I said. The ones you wrote between August and March, the ones you believed I never received, I have now received them. I have read all of them. She was looking at the box with the contained, careful look she brought to things that were significant and required accurate apprehension. "All the way to March," she said. "Yes, the last one," I stopped. "I know what the last one says," she said. "I remember it." "Tuesdays," I said. Something moved in her face. The sealed Elspeth Crane disappeared and something older appeared instead, and I recognized it as what had moved very briefly across her face in the church when she first saw me in the doorway, except now it was not brief. She did not look away. "I should have come to you directly," I said. "In August or September, when the replies stopped, I should have come to the vicarage and asked. I did not, and I do not have an excuse that I am not ashamed of." You thought I had decided the correspondence was not appropriate, she said. That is a reasonable conclusion to draw from silence. It is, I said. It is the conclusion she wanted me to draw, but I did not test it. I accepted it. I looked at the cedar box. I was afraid, that is the truth of it. She considered this. I watched her consider it. I was afraid, too, she said. After she visited, I was afraid that I had understood the correspondence as something it was not, that what had seemed to me like the beginning of something was not what I thought it was. And she was very kind and very clear, and she left me no point to argue with. She paused. She is a very good manager. She is, I said, the best I have encountered. A sound came out of her then that was not quite a laugh. A small sound, compressed, that acknowledged the absurdity without quite permitting itself the full expression. Then she put her hand on the cedar box. May I take this home? She said. They are your letters, I said. All of them. She lifted the box and held it in her lap. I want to read them, she said, all of them in order. There is something else I want to say, I said, before you take them. She looked at me. I said what I had been working toward for 11 years, and what I had almost said in a lich gate in November, and a churchyard in May, and a library in January, and a dozen other moments across the years when the thing was present, and the architecture of my mother's management was also present, and I had been too accustomed to walls. I said it without the ornamentation and without the framing, because she had said once that she would rather suffer for the right reason than be comfortable for the wrong one, and the right thing was always the direct thing. I love you, I said. I have loved you since a Tuesday afternoon in a lich gate in November, which is an inconvenient place and an inconvenient time, and I am not a man who says things simply as a general rule. But that is the simple thing, and I am saying it, and I am also asking you if you are willing to marry me. The schoolroom was very quiet. Outside, the village went about its late afternoon in the September light. A cart went by in the lane. You managed to get the essential thing into the first 3 words, she said. Yes, I said. I did not want to lose the essential thing in the rest of it. I love you, she said, as directly as I had said it because she was Elspeth Crane and that was the register she moved in. I have known since I have known it for some time. I will not tell you when, because the when is tangled up with the cedar box and the 11 years, and I think some things are better untangled before they are examined. Yes, I agreed. But yes, she said, under the conditions I mentioned, which are, I intend to finish the burial indexing, which now reaches 1498, and I think it can go further. I intend to continue the school. I intend to finish the Latin and then the Greek if I can manage it, because the Greek inscription on the 1689 memorial in the northeast section has been bothering me for 2 years. She paused. And I intend, if your mother calls at the vicarage again, to receive her myself and to be perfectly civil and to manage the conversation in my own way. Not your way, and not her way. Mind. I crossed the room, it was perhaps 8 steps, and she stood up from the too small desk, and I took her hands, which were cold in the autumn air, in the way that her hands were always cold in autumn and winter because she was always in unheated buildings teaching things to people in them, and this was not a quality she considered correcting. She looked at me with those steady brown eyes that had always been looking at the thing clearly. I had spent 8 years thinking about that look, and now I had it again, and the thing I noticed, which I had not expected to notice, was that it was the same look. Not aged, not altered, not cautious in a way the years had earned. The same, entirely present, entirely uncalculated, attending to what was in front of it with the full weight of a mind that found things important without being told to. Agreed, I said, on all conditions, the indexing and the school and the Greek and the management of my mother to whatever degree management is available, all of it. The Greek may take some time, she said. The primer is not very systematic. I have a systematic grammar in the library, I said. It was my father's. He read classical Greek with some facility, though he always said the verb system was a matter of brute memorization, and he never made peace with it. I expect I will make peace with it, she said. I expect you will, I said. You made peace with the Latin. The Latin was easier than the medieval devotional made it appear, she said. The devotional had strong feelings about the subjunctive. She was looking at me and I was looking at her, and there was something in the exchange that was, in its texture, very like the correspondence. very like the quality of a conversation where both parties are actually present and are attending to the same thing from different angles and finding, in the difference, something more accurate than either angle alone. "Then yes," she said. "To all of it." I held her hands in the September afternoon in the schoolroom with the chalk dust and the county map and the multiplication lesson still on the board, and we stood there for quite a long time without speaking, because some things are best received in silence, and this was one of them. The afternoon light moved on the floor, and the sparrows outside had a different argument from the one in the churchyard, and settled it with similar dispatch. The cedar box was on the table between us. The cockerel turned east. We announced the engagement in October to the county in the conventional way. A notice in the county paper, a round of calls to the neighboring families, a dinner at the hall for the principal local connections. The dinner was the first of any social significance at Aldmere Hall that I had given in some years, and Mrs. Arden, Mr. Arden's wife, who oversaw the household management, arranged it with the particular energy of a woman who has been waiting for the house to be used properly and is now permitted to demonstrate what properly means. Elspeth attended the dinner as my betrothed, in a gown of deep blue that Cecily had been firm about. It was the first gown she had ever agreed to wear that was neither gray nor dove-colored nor in any other way designed to efface itself, and it did not efface itself. She sat at the other end of the table and talked to the neighboring families with the attentiveness she brought to everything, and I watched her from my end and thought about August of the correspondence year, and about the specific quality of managing something you did not know you were managing. The response from the county was varied. Several of the neighboring families received the news with genuine warmth. Elspeth had been teaching their children and attending to their parish for 8 years, and a woman who had occupied the county's social conscience with such consistent grace was not, in the end, a figure the county was prepared to dismiss without examination. They had seen her on ladders in churchyards and behind slate boards in side aisles, and they had left their children in her care on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and received them back knowing more than they had left with. And there is a kind of trust that builds in a community that no amount of social positioning can manufacture. The Morvern family, who had had Lady Beatrice in mind for the position, was quietly displeased. No one mentioned it directly, and I did not require them to. Lady Beatrice herself had married a baronet from Derbyshire the previous spring, and was, by all accounts, content. Reverend Crane wept at the announcement, which he did without embarrassment, because he was a man who had always cried at the things that deserved crying over and had long ago made his peace with this. He embraced me with the warmth of a man who has been waiting 8 years to embrace someone and has been too polite to say so. He embraced Elspeth and said something in her ear that made her laugh and put her cheek against his for a moment, and I turned slightly away to give them the moment, because it was not mine. Marcus Crane came home from Bath for a fortnight. He was now 23, and employed in a solicitor's office with the dogged persistence of a man who's going to get there eventually by virtue of not stopping. And he arrived with a new coat that had all its buttons correctly sewn, and a manner that had settled considerably from the scowling boy of the battered trap. He was delighted in the particular way of a younger brother who has worried for his elder sister for a long time, and has now been relieved of the worry. He was also, I thought, somewhat delighted for his own reasons, which became clear over dinner when he said, with the careful casualness of a man approaching something indirectly, that he had been looking at the county legal practices for potential positions, and that there were 1 or 2 in the Aldmere area that seemed promising. I told him I would speak to the county solicitor, who was a personal acquaintance, and Marcus was grateful with the straightforwardness of someone who has not yet learned to conceal gratitude. Cecily Crane was 18 and had been engaged for 6 months to a young farmer's son from the neighboring parish, an honest and sturdy young man named Hewitt who had gone to Elspeth's evening class for 2 years and could now read a land document and keep accounts, and was, in every respect that mattered, exactly what Cecily required. They were to be married in the spring. Cecily was delighted about the engagement with the uninhibited energy of someone for whom the constraint of maintaining any other expression was simply too much effort, and she immediately began planning the wedding breakfast with the focused determination of someone who has been thinking about a wedding breakfast since before either party to the wedding was engaged. My mother came to the table, fulfilled her social obligations, and was civil to Elspeth. She did not congratulate her. She also did not oppose, which under the circumstances I treated as what it was. A recognition that the war was over and that opposition was no longer a practical option. Whether the recognition went deeper than the practical, whether she arrived in those weeks at anything like an acknowledgement of what she had done and what it had cost, I did not know and did not press. She was 82 years old. The accounting was between her and whatever accounting she kept. In November, I sat down with the 47 letters and a pot of tea and read them from the beginning as a conversation, alternating between hers and mine, in chronological order, the way they had been meant to be read. I had read each bundle separately in the cedar box. This was different. Reading them as a conversation was like watching a room be assembled piece by piece, every piece exactly right. A room that neither of us had been permitted to enter, but that had existed anyway in the letters themselves, as real as any room in the hall. Her letters in the conversation were everything I had loved in the correspondence and everything I had not had in the years since. The slightly crooked observation, the angle on the world, the thing that was noticed at a tilt and was therefore truer than a straight-on examination would have been. My letters in the conversation were more than I had remembered. I had remembered the letters as correspondence, as the exchange of ideas. Reading them in sequence against hers, I saw that they were not that, or not only that. They were the letters of a man who was, without quite saying so, saying so. In December, I gave the sorted letters to Elspeth, in the cedar box, as a wedding gift. I told her what was in it and what I had done with it, and she looked at the box with the look she gave things that were significant and required accurate apprehension, and she took it home with her that evening. She came back the next morning. Her eyes were somewhat redder than usual, in the way of someone who has been crying quietly and with great self-command for a considerable time, and she had the letter from August, the second one I had sent from London. The one about the Augustan reforms and Pliny, and the question at the end that was not about either, in her hand. "You wrote this in August," she said. "Yes." "And she took it before it reached me." "Yes." She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it very carefully and put it back in the box. "I think," she said, "that I am going to need the Cicero very soon, as a matter of some urgency." "It is on the reading desk in the library," I said. "The desk by the east window, not the table, so you do not have to stand while you are working." She looked at me. The slightly crooked smile appeared, further on the left than the right, the one that came up without any instruction from the part of the face that managed social expressions. "You arranged the desk," she said. "Several weeks ago," I said. "I thought it was the more practical option." "It is," she said. She was still smiling. "I know you," she said. "I have known you for 8 years, and in 47 letters, and I know you." I thought about that, what it meant to be known by someone who had read your letters, and listened in a lich gate and watched you reason through things, and had, at the end of it, said that she knew you. It seemed to me the most valuable thing anyone had ever said in my hearing. "Yes," I said, "I believe you do." We were married in January, in the church at Aldmere, on a morning when the frost was hard on the churchyard stones, and the weather-vane cockerel stood pointing east in the thin winter light. Reverend Crane wept again, which he had promised Elspeth he would try not to do, and which everyone, including Elspeth, had known he would do. The congregation was the village in its best clothes and the county in a selection of their best clothes, and there were representatives from several of the neighboring families who had, in the end, arranged their social opinions to accommodate the facts, which were: the new Duchess of Aldmere was known to every tenant, every child, every widow in the parish, and was considered by the people who actually lived in the county, as distinct from the people who held land in it, to be exactly what she was. She came down the aisle in a gown of pale ivory silk that she had found at the county town modistes on the ground that it was quiet and sensible, and as she said to Cecily, who had strong opinions about the gown, that she had been wearing sensible things for 31 years and was not sure she knew how to wear anything else, and did not want her wedding day to begin with a lesson. The modiste had made one concession to the occasion. The bodice had a small trimming of Brussels lace at the neckline and the cuffs, which had been in the modiste stock, and which the modiste had apparently been waiting for the right occasion to deploy. The effect was exactly right, quiet and lovely at once, the way Elspeth herself was at once. Cecily had won the negotiation on the question of flowers by pointing out that hothouse flowers were available through the hall's kitchen-garden connections, and that it would be a waste of available resources not to use them. The spray was white, winter roses and a few sprigs of boxwood, and it was tucked in at the waist rather than carried. because Elspeth said she had no desire to spend her wedding ceremony preventing flowers from falling, which was a practical objection that no one could argue with. She came down the aisle on her father's arm and looked at me and had the look steady and very long, seeing the thing clearly as she always had. I said the vows with the full attention they deserved. She said hers with the deliberateness of a person who takes words seriously and has never said a word she did not mean. After, in the frost of the churchyard, while the parish milled around us and Cecily superintended the direction of guests toward the vicarage, my mother stood apart for a moment, and I saw her look at Elspeth. It was the first time I had seen my mother look at Elspeth without management in the look. What it contained I cannot say with precision. It was not warm, not cold. Something in between. Something that might, given enough time, have been something else. I did not pursue the observation. I went to my wife. My mother died in the 6th year of the marriage, in the spring in her own room with the household around her. She had been in indifferent health since the autumn before, the particular indifferent health of someone who is 82 and has been managing everything for 60 years and is tired in the bone, and the tiredness finally outweighed the will. She kept the management going until 3 weeks before the end, directing the household from her bed with the same precision she had always directed it, adjusting for the limitation of not being able to rise by adjusting her instructions. At the end, she called for Elspeth. I was in the room. What my mother said to her I will not repeat, because it was not for me. It belonged to both of them and not to me, and there are some things a man witnesses in his own household that are not his to distribute. What I saw was Elspeth hold my mother's hand and listen with the full Elspeth Crane attention, entirely present, entirely uncalculated, and then say something quiet in return. Then she sat with her for a while, not speaking. Then she came out of the room and passed me in the doorway and put her hand briefly on my arm, and that is everything I will say about it. In the months after my mother's death, I sorted through her papers, with Mr. Arden's assistance, in the methodical way that estates require. The arrangement with the old solicitor, Mr. Whitfield's predecessor, was among the documents, and the notation in the dead solicitor's hand, received per Lady Aldmere's instruction, certain personal correspondence belonging to the Duke's private file, to be stored, not returned, paid 12s. For a cedar box, the young woman has been informed that H.G. does not continue the correspondence and wishes her well, was in the file with the other personal arrangements. I showed it to Elspeth. She read it twice, with the even careful expression she brought to things that were accurate and painful at once. 12 shillings, she said. For the box and the archiving, I said. She was quiet for a moment. She paid to have our letters preserved, she said. She did not destroy them. No, I said. That is, she stopped. Then she said slowly, I think that is complicated. Yes, I said, it is. We sat with the complication for a while in the library. Elspeth was at the reading desk, the one I had put by the east window, which had been her desk for 6 years now, and which had developed, as desks do when one person uses them consistently, a particular arrangement of things that was entirely hers. The Cicero in the corner and the current county record in the middle, and the small box of charcoal sticks she used for rubbings beside the ink bottle. She looked at the notation in the dead solicitor's hand, and then she set it down. She was afraid, Elspeth said. I looked at her. Not of me, she said. Of you, of what you would choose if left to choose. She thought she knew what Aldmere needed better than you did, and she was afraid that you would choose wrongly. She paused. I think that is a thing that happens to people who love very hard and have very little trust in the people they love. It is not a justification, I said. No, she agreed. It is not a justification. It is only a shape. She looked at the county record for a moment. She held my hand at the end, she said. That is also a shape. I looked at my wife in the spring afternoon in the library with the east light on her braided hair and the Cicero in the corner and the ink stain on her left forefinger. And I thought about all the shapes that people are when they are trying to love and managing it badly, and about the difference between understanding and forgiving, and about the fact that Elspeth had sat with my mother's hand in hers at the end, and said whatever she had said, and how much of that was simply who Elspeth was. You are a better person than I am, I said. I have had more practice at vicarages, she said, which was not quite agreement and not quite deflection and was, as her responses tended to be, entirely itself. Now I am 45. I am telling you this story in the library of Aldmere Hall, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, at the reading desk by the east window, which is not where I usually sit. But Elspeth has the estate survey of 1800 spread across the library table and the county record beside it, and the reading desk has better light in the afternoons at this time of year. She has been generous about the desk. She said she preferred the table anyway, because the table was large enough to hold multiple volumes at once, and that was what the county record required. We have been married 11 years. The east wing roof held for 6 years, and then required the work it had required since before my first London trip, and we had it done properly by a firm from the county town who had done the Harrow farmhouse the previous autumn and who were, by all accounts, reliable. The roof has been sound since. The drainage scheme in the south field that occasioned my return in the 8th year is now functioning precisely as intended, and young Wicket, who has expanded his acreage in the interim by purchase rather than dispute, calls it the Aldmere improvement when he mentions it at the County Agricultural Society, which he does with some frequency. The burial indexing reached 1498 in the year after the wedding, and 1471 the year after that, and has now reached the middle of the 15th century, where the Latin grows more complex and the script more difficult. And Elspeth has taken to doing rubbings of the inscriptions, and working from the rubbings rather than from the originals directly, which she says is more accurate because the rubbing reveals what the stone has to say rather than what she expects the stone to say. The school has 42 pupils now. We built a proper building for it, full-sized, on land that I gave to the parish for the purpose, and there are 2 teachers in addition to Elspeth. A young woman from the county town who teaches the afternoon sessions, and Elspeth's sister Cecily, who comes on Thursday mornings. The evening class for adult women has grown to 23 regular attendees, and is considered, quietly and without any particular announcement, one of the things the county can be proud of, though the county in question does not always know quite how to classify it. Reverend Crane is 71 and in good health that he says is a gift he did not merit, and I suspect is partly the result of Elspeth's management of his diet and his sleeping hours, which she conducts with the same efficiency, and without the same architectural style as her mother-in-law's management. The key difference being that Elspeth's management is transparent and invites debate, and her subjects generally decide on their own that she is right without feeling managed. Her father is still absorbed in the medieval tablet in the church foundations, which has now been partially deciphered with the help of a professor at the university in the south, and which turns out to be a legal charter of the 1340s relating to the original parish boundary. Elspeth has made a full rubbing. It hangs in the study, framed. Marcus Crane is now at a firm in the county town and has been there for 7 years, having started as a junior clerk and reached the position of second partner last spring, which he accomplished by the same mechanism he had been applying since the battered trap. Sustained persistence in the direction of the thing, without stopping. He married 2 years ago, a widow from the next county with 2 children, and a direct manner that Marcus appears to find both alarming and irresistible in equal measure. He is very happy. Cecily and young Hewitt have 3 children. The first is named Thomas, after her father. The second is a girl named Dorothea, which I had not expected, and which Elspeth did not explain to me when I expressed mild surprise. The third is a boy of 2 who has not yet developed a fixed personality, but has already acquired the habit of picking up small stones and carrying them in his pockets, which Cecily says she cannot account for, and which Elspeth watches with an expression I have learned to recognize as privately pleased. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, 4 years into the marriage, my mother came to one of the evening classes at the school without telling anyone she was coming. Elspeth told me when she came home. She told me without comment, in the way she reported facts that were significant and that she was still reasoning through, which meant she set the fact down in the air between us and let me encounter it without guidance. She had arrived, apparently, near the beginning of the session. She had sat in the back row in the chair that was generally empty because it was near the door and there was a draft. She had observed the class for approximately 45 minutes. Then she had left before the end quietly without speaking to anyone. I said nothing that evening. I filed the information the way she had given it, uninterpreted for now. 3 days later my mother came to the library, which she had not done of her own accord in all the years I had been in residence as a grown man. She came in the afternoon when she knew Elspeth was at the school, and she sat in the chair by the east window, Elspeth's chair, though my mother could not have known it, and she sat with her hands in her lap, which was the only posture that ever revealed that she was not entirely at ease, because she usually moved her hands. She said without preamble, "She is a very good teacher." "Yes," I said. A silence that was somewhat longer than she usually permitted. "I was not wrong about Aldmere," she said. "What I believed Aldmere needed, the continuity, the correct alliances, the management of the household standing in the county. I was not wrong about the importance of those things." "No," I said, "you were not wrong about the importance. You were wrong about who was capable of providing them." She was quiet again. She looked at the east window, which was, at that time of afternoon, letting in the kind of thin November light that makes everything in the room look a little more precisely what it is. "Perhaps," she said. It was the only acknowledgement she ever made. I do not say she was wrong to make no more acknowledgement than that. She was 82 and had organized her entire life around a set of convictions that it cost her something, privately, to examine. I say only that she made it in the library in the afternoon, looking at the east window, and that the library was my father's room and she knew it, and she chose it. What she said before she left, "Your father would have approved." She meant Elspeth. I do not think she said it as praise, exactly. I think she said it as the most accurate available statement in the register she had available for statements of that kind. "I know," I said. "She left. We did not speak of it again. She and I, we did not need to. Some things are complete in the saying, and this was one. What remains is not a story. It is a life, and a life resists the shapes that stories prefer, which is one of the things that distinguishes it from a story and that I have come to regard as a feature rather than a defect. A story has a shape because someone has chosen it, the elements included, the elements excluded, the proportions of the telling. A life has no such editor. It is simply itself, occurring at the pace it occurs, without particular regard for narrative clarity or the patience of the audience. But there are things I want to set down here, because a man who has spent 45 years learning to say things directly ought to practice the habit even when no one is listening. And because the things that happened after the cedar box are, in their quiet accumulation, the truer story. The courtship was the drama. The marriage has been the meaning. I want to set down that in the first winter of the marriage, when the household was still arranging itself around the new order of things, which is to say, around the fact that the library table was now regularly occupied by 2 sets of books rather than 1, and that the Morning Post occasionally contained a letter in a very small, even hand addressed to the Duchess rather than to the Duke, which the household sorted for some weeks before establishing that the Duchess preferred to receive her own correspondence directly. I came into the library one evening to find Elspeth sitting at the table with the first volume of Virgil in Latin and a grammar opened beside it, making notes on a sheet of paper in the perpendicular manner that meant she was cross-referencing. She looked up. "I have been wondering," she said, "whether the translation I have been working from is entirely reliable or whether it has taken liberties." "Which translation?" I said. She told me it had taken liberties. I had a better one on the shelf. We spent the next 2 hours going through the Aeneid's first book with both versions and the Latin, and I was not useful. I had the Latin well enough for the purpose, but not well enough to be fast, and she was useful with the patience I would have expected, identifying the choices the translator had made and evaluating whether they were defensible. It became a habit of that winter. Tuesday evenings with the Virgil and both translations, she in the original and I in the version she was correcting when I got it wrong, which was more often than I would admit to anyone except her. And she knew it was more often than I would admit to anyone else and said nothing about it, which is one of the finer qualities in a partner. I want to set down that the Latin reached Virgil in the 2nd year of our marriage, and that reading the Aeneid together, she in the original, I in the translation she corrected whenever I got it wrong, which was more often than I would admit to anyone else, was one of the finest things I have done in my life, and is one of the things I would do again if I were given again the entirety of it. I want to set down that the Greek inscription on the 1689 memorial was deciphered in the 3rd year, and that it was not, as she had suspected, from a classical source, but was in fact a quotation from a Byzantine ecclesiastical text that had no known parish connection, and that she has been trying to account for ever since, the pursuit of which has led her into a correspondence with a scholar in Athens and the acquisition of a modern Greek phrasebook, which sits on the reading desk beside the Cicero, and has been there long enough to suggest that the modern Greek is more useful to the project than the phrasebook scope was originally intended to cover. The scholar in Athens is named Papadakis, and he writes in French, which Elspeth has been learning from the correspondence rather than from a systematic study, which is the Elspeth Crane method. Learn the thing from the thing itself, and resort to the grammar only when the thing itself is insufficient. She learned the parish burial records by reading them. She learned the Latin from the records that required Latin. She has learned the French from the letters of a Greek scholar discussing a Byzantine text found in an English churchyard, which is a narrow curriculum but a highly motivated one. I want to set down that she has, at some point in the last 2 years, begun teaching one of the children from the evening school's alumni, a girl of 14 who was in the original morning class and who has a particular gift for mathematics, with the intention of preparing her for entry to a ladies' college, which is a project that has required some correspondence with the institution in question and considerable quiet organization, and which Elspeth has mentioned to me only as a matter of fact, and not as a thing requiring my involvement, because she has not learned to ask for involvement in things she is capable of managing, and because I have learned not to offer it unless she asks. I want to set down that we argue sometimes, in the easy, specific way of people who are used to each other and trust the arguing, about county affairs, about what to do with the South Stable, about the degree to which the estate's social obligations can be renegotiated without disrupting the relationships that matter, about the school's expansion, and whether a third teacher is the right step or a larger building, about whether the drainage scheme needs the county engineer or can be resolved locally, about the 1689 Byzantine inscription, and whether the most likely account is the one that requires the least additional evidence or the one that best fits the evidence available. The inscription arguments are the best ones. She is a systematic thinker about evidence, and I am a systematic thinker about plausibility, and these are not always the same direction, and the gap between them is usually where the accurate answer lives. She argues in the Elspeth Crane way, calmly, with evidence, pausing before she speaks, choosing the precise word rather than the convenient one, conceding the point when the point is conceded rather than defending it past its defensible limit. I argue in the manner of my family, firmly and with some heat, until the evidence accumulates against me to a degree that I cannot in good conscience continue to defend my position, at which point I concede entirely and without grudge, which she says is one of the more useful habits I have. I have told her it is the Stanhope side. She has said she does not think it is because the Stanhope side tends toward the architectural calm and my arguing style is not architectural. She is probably right. She usually is. We always resolve things. We always resolve them in the direction of the accurate answer, which is the only direction either of us is genuinely interested in. And this is, I think, one of the things that makes a marriage work when it works. Not the agreement itself, but the shared conviction that the agreement should be the accurate one. I want to set down that on the morning of our 8th wedding anniversary, which fell on a Tuesday, which she found amusing and I found fitting, because it was the first Tuesday of the month, and the first Tuesday of the month was when the post arrived in the morning rather than at noon. And we had been married on a Tuesday in January, and Tuesdays had always been, between us, the specific weight they were, she brought to the breakfast table without explanation. The original letter from March of the correspondence year, the last one she had written before she stopped. It was in the cedar box, which now lived on the shelf in the study between the Gibbon and the Natural History of the County, the same books she had borrowed on that first Thursday. She had taken the letter out of the box and brought it to breakfast and set it beside my cup, without comment, and I looked at it and looked at her. "I thought you should have it," she said. "It was always yours." "It is not," I said. "I wrote it to you," she said. "That makes it yours." She poured her tea and opened the county record she had brought to breakfast, as she did most mornings, because the county record was what she was working on, and breakfast was a good time for it when the house was quiet. And I held the letter and thought about the 8 years between the writing of it and the morning of our 8th anniversary, which was the same number of years as the time between, and which seemed to me, I am not a sentimental man, but it seemed to me, to close a circle that had been open for a very long time. I will think of Tuesdays differently. I thought about all the Tuesdays since, and all the Tuesdays to come, and the way a Tuesday afternoon in November is also every other Tuesday afternoon, layered and gathered, because time, as Augustine observed, in the passage she had been thinking about in October of the correspondence year, is not strictly one thing at a time. I put the letter in my jacket pocket, where it remained for 3 days, and then I put it in the cedar box with the others where it belongs. This is what I want to say at the end of it. I am 45 years old and a duke, and I have managed a large estate for more than 20 years, and I have, by the account of the people who attend to these things, done it adequately. I have discharged my obligations. I have maintained Aldmere in the condition my father would have approved of and my mother would have approved of, the condition of a house that knows what it is and continues to be it without drama or disruption. The roof holds. The accounts are correct. The tenants are treated fairly and know it. The county knows who Aldmere is and what it stands for. None of that is what I think about on Tuesday afternoons. What I think about is a 19-minute conversation in a lich gate in November, with the weather vane pointing east, with a woman who was looking at the sky when I arrived and who said it would pass in quarter of an hour and was exactly right. What I think about is a note in the margin of the Gibbon, slightly perpendicular, about a footnote that Gibbon got wrong, and she found in a burial record. What I think about is a letter from March about eternity and Tuesday afternoons, written in the full knowledge that it would not be answered and sent anyway. I think about 47 letters in a cedar box. I think about a reading desk by the east window with a Cicero in the corner and an inkstand and a modern Greek phrase book, and the current volume of whatever the county burial survey has reached, which is the 1430s now and shows every sign of being capable of going further. I think about a woman who held my mother's hand at the end and said something quiet, and who has never told me what she said. I think about what it is to be known, not managed, not constructed, not correctly assembled for the purposes of Aldmere, but known, in the specific way that comes from 19 minutes in a lich gate and 47 letters and 11 years of Tuesday afternoons. It is the thing I had no word for at 26, when I noted the particular quality of her attention in the church doorway, and found it remarkable and could not yet name why. I have the word now. It is presence. It is what it means to be in the same room as someone who is actually there. I am in the same room as her now. She is at the library table with the 1800 estate survey and the county record and the cup of tea that has gone cold because she is reading something that has caught her at the particular angle. The afternoon light is horizontal at this time of year and comes through the tall windows and lies across her hands and the dark honey of her hair. The Cicero is in the corner of the reading desk where it always is. The weather vane cockerel is pointing east. She looks up. She says, without any preamble, the south wall position in 1800 contradicts the 1740 survey at the wicket boundary again. Someone moved the wall a third time. Of course they did, I say. My family have always had opinions about that wall. Your tenants have had opinions about your family's opinions, she says. She is looking at the survey with a slight tilt of the head that means she is reasoning. It will have to be resurveyed. I will ask Wicket's boy, I say. Yes, she says. That is the practical answer. She goes back to the survey. Then she says, without looking up, are you working on the correspondence? I look at the letters on the desk before me, the estate correspondence. It does not interest me very much today. No, I say. What are you doing? Thinking, I say, about Tuesday afternoons. She looks up. The slightly crooked smile comes, the real one, further on the left than the right. It has not changed in 11 years and will not change, because it is not the smile she learned but the one she has. Eternity, she says. Yes, I say, exactly that. She goes back to the survey. Outside, the weather vane turns in the November wind. The fire in the east grate has settled into the steady warmth it finds by late afternoon, and the light moves, and I sit in my chair with the letters before me and Elspeth at the table, and the Cicero in the corner of the reading desk, and I hold what I have. I hold 47 letters returned and found. I hold a school that is loud 4 mornings a week and serves more children every year. I hold a woman who taught herself Latin from a medieval devotional and counted the stones a boy left in a church porch and held my mother's hand at the end and told me very directly that she would rather suffer for the right reason than be comfortable for the wrong one. I hold a Tuesday afternoon that is also every Tuesday afternoon, in a library that has always been large enough for 2, in a life that came to us 11 years late and came nevertheless. The man I am at 45 is not the man I was at 34, and that man was not the man I was at 26, and none of them were precisely the Duke of Aldmere my mother had intended to build. But I am the Duke of Aldmere that my father would have recognized, the one who finds things important without being told to, the one who has the habit of reading and the habit of attention and the particular incurable habit of looking toward the East Lane in autumn to see what might arrive. Something arrived. It arrived in a gray pelisse with a basket of parish accounts and a philosophical opinion about fallen wheels, and a way of telling the truth that made you feel, uneasily and precisely, that accuracy was possible. I have not stopped being grateful for it. The weather vane points east. The afternoon light thins. The frost will come tonight, and the churchyard will be still, and in the library Elspeth, Duchess of Aldmere, will finish the survey or will set it aside and take up the county record, or will make a note in the margin that is slightly perpendicular and very even and slightly more chaotic where she has arrived at something that matters. I will be here. I have loved her since November, and it is November again, and I will love her until every Tuesday is used up. That is the true and complete account of the matter.